Hello guys, welcome to another of our video tutorial class, and I am Adua Samuel C by name. Today we'll be discussing about the variables. I am sure most of us must have heard about the word variables and must have also heard about the meaning. But today I'm going to be giving a brief explanation about the variables, then we'll go into the practical session. So we say variables are names, values are stored with, okay? They are like a placeholder in the computer storage capacity. They are what the system stores in place of the value that they contain. Okay, so we can liken a variable to a box. Rather, we can liken a variable to a box, a container that contains other items. So a variable contains values while containers contain items. Okay, so depending on the type of values that are stored in the variables, we have different types of variables, and today we are going to be looking at each and every one of it. So sit back and relax and enjoy the class. All right, so we're going to go into the practical section of the class, and we'll start with the first one. You can say name to be let's say Samuel. Let's start with that. Now this type of variable is assigned to a string. Now this is called a string because it is enclosed in double quote. This double quote can also be a single quote, so depending on the one you start with, that is also what you're going to end with. If you start with the single quote, you're going to end with the single quote. You can't start with the single quote and end with the double quote, or start with the double quote and end with the single quote. The computer will pop up an error for you. Okay, so either you say this or that. All right, so each of these is an example of a string. So this is a string. Let's hashtag it, a string. So whenever you see a statement that is in double quotes or in single quotes, it is called a string. Okay, so like we have given in some of our explanations, we said a variable is likened to a container or a placeholder, something that can hold something else. Okay, so this name here is what we call a variable. A variable is always the one by the left hand side of your program before the assignment operator. This is actually an assignment operator and not an equal to sign like we know in mathematics. Okay, but we are going to go into operators in mathematics and in Python, so I will compare them to that of mathematics, then we'll see the differences. Okay, so this is an example of a variable, and this here is the value that is assigned or stored inside this variable name. Okay, so the type of value that is stored in this variable is a string. It is a string because it is enclosed in a double quote or in a single quote. So whenever you see any value at all that is enclosed in a single quote or in a double quote, that value type is called a string, or the data type is called a string. Okay, so we're going to go into the next one so we can actually explain what we're talking about with different types of variables. Now we can say another one to be num. Let's assign num to be 100. Now this is another type of variable, and this type of variable now contains what we call an integer, what you know in mathematics as a whole number. So it's actually a number without a decimal point. So any number without a decimal point is called an integer in programming, also in mathematics. So we can comment that to be an integer. Okay, so this is an integer, and if we go further to give another example, let's say we have lists. There are so many of them, so we are going to be giving a few. A list. This is a list, so we can comment that also. This is a list. can go further to itemize other ones, so whenever we see them, we know we're actually talking about a variable. All right, so the next thing we are going to be looking at also is another type of integer, but this time around it contains a decimal point, which makes it not to be an integer anymore. So the name is a float. We call it a float, or we call it a floating point number, but float for short. I'm also going to be giving the short name for each of these data types we have actually mentioned. So for you to identify a float, you can assign num1 to be, let's say, 20.5. It's an example of a floating point number. So this is what it is seen as, a floating point number. Any number with a decimal point is seen as a floating point number, or a float for short. Okay, so whenever you see that or you hear that, you know the person is actually referring to a floating point number, or a float for short. All right, so we are also going to talk about a set. Let's say set1, it's equal to, set1 is denoted with curly braces. You can give it any number at all, any name at all, anything at all. All right, this is an example of a set. Okay, so we are actually going to comment that out, say that this is a set. So why we're actually listing and explaining them is because by the time we'll go further into the class, we will not be able to go into details each of these data types. So right now I'm going to be explaining them once more. Now the name here, everything on the left hand side is a variable. Name is a variable, num is a variable, list1 is a variable, num1 is a variable, set1 is a variable. Then everything on the right hand side is a value. Everything here is a value. Now we now have different types of value. They are also data. Now we have also data types. Now depending on the arrangement of the value, we can assign a particular data type to it. Now this is Samuel. It is actually enclosed in a double quote, and this is a single quote. Like I told you, any of it can go, but you don't have to combine them at the beginning or at the end of every input. Okay, so this first one is a string because it has double quote, like I said earlier, and we use str as a short form of string. So whenever you see str, just know that the person is referring to string as a data type. And the second one is num to be equal to 100, and we say that it is a data type called an integer. An integer is like a whole number in mathematics. It has no decimal point. So whenever you see a number in your programming or in your coding, you know that that number is an integer. Now integer is int for short, int. So whenever you see the abbreviation int, you know that that number inside the bracket is an integer, or it wants to be converted to an integer. Okay, now the next one is list. I actually added this one because list is already a keyword in Python. If I am to remove this one, I'm sure Python will highlight the list as a name because it's already a keyword function in Python. As you can see, there is already a red underline there. So we'll place our one. We're trying to let the system know that we are not talking about that list that is a keyword. We are talking about our own list. Okay, so that differentiates it from the one that the compiler is already familiar with. Okay, so a list is a collection of items, a group of items. So in this case now we have given the items to be odd numbers, 1, 3, 5, etc. A list can also contain different types of data. A list can contain a number, which is an integer. A list can contain a floating point number, which is a float. A list can contain a string. So but in this case we want to be uniform, so you understand what we are talking about. Okay, so this is an example of a list, which is also a data type. Right, now the next one is num1. We want to use this one now to differentiate the other one here, so they won't be the same, because if we remove this one, the system will be referring to this one to mean the same thing, and we can't have two variables having the same name. All right, variables are supposed to be words that are meaningful, words that have meaning. You don't just assign any name to anything else, to a variable, and you expect someone to read meaning into it. No, as a programmer, you need to write your code in such a way that it will have meaning to whoever that is trying to interpret what you must have coded. Okay, so num1 is equal to 20.5, and like I told you before, that any number that has a decimal point is called a floating point number, or a float for short. The next one is set. A set is a collection just like the list. In fact, it's formed one of the 4 data collection data types we have in Python. The first one is the list, like we've mentioned here. The second one is the set that we're talking about here. The third one is the tuple, though I didn't write that here. I'm still going to talk about that in the later class, though I'll still write it here. Then the fourth one is the dictionary. I'm not going to write that here because that one is going to be on a different class. I'm going to do a separate video on that and explain it better. Okay, so the difference between the set and the list is that the list, like we know here, the 1 here is occupying the index 0, the 3 here is occupying the index 1, the 5 here is occupying the index 2, but the set here is an ordered data set collection, meaning that this 2 here is not occupying the index 0, so it's unordered. It doesn't have any pattern. Okay, another second difference is that a set is denoted with a curly braces like we have seen here, while a list is denoted with square braces or square brackets, as the case may be. Okay, so the other one I'm going to, just for sake of the knowledge, is the tuple. Okay, the tuple is one of the 4 data collection data types we have, like I said earlier, and it is denoted with the normal brackets. Okay, it could contain any number at all. Now the main difference between this tuple and every other data type we've been talking about is that this tuple is unchangeable. You cannot change any data inside it. You cannot take away any data from here, neither can you add. So the difference between this and any of these other data types is that this one is not mutable. You cannot change anything, whereas other ones are mutable. And this one is also denoted with this normal bracket that we all know, but these other ones are denoted with different brackets. Okay, so that is the main difference between the tuple and other data collection data types that we have in Python. Okay, I guess with this you have been able to understand briefly what variables are, and depending on the type of data types that are assigned to the variables, we have different types of variable, like I've just explained to us. Okay, see you in our next class. Take care.